Namaste and kia ora. I'm Christine Naden-Sharp, the Chief Executive of the Aspen Institute New Zealand, and together with our partner, Ananta Aspen, we're absolutely delighted to welcome you to the first of a series of dialogues between our two countries. Our purpose is to turbocharge the relationship by opening new channels of communication through the Institute's international network. And we aim to firstly better understand the nuances of the relationship, explore its potential scope, and thirdly, identify opportunities and of course any shortcomings for business and overall collaboration. We're honored to have a distinguished group on the panel: Indrani Bashi, Dr. Jagannath Panda, and High Commissioner David Pine. Indrani, my counterpart, has recently taken up the role of the Chief Executive of Ananta Aspen Centre. And previously, Indrani was a diplomatic editor with the Times of India, reporting on foreign policy issues for more than a decade. Dr. Jagannath Panda is head of the Stockholm Centre for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. Jagannath is also the editor for the Institute's Security and Development Policy and well-known author. His most recent works include Scaling India-Japan Cooperation and Beyond 2025. High Commissioner David Pine is a highly experienced diplomat and is New Zealand's High Commissioner to India, Bangladesh, and Ambassador to Nepal, and previously was New Zealand's High Commissioner to Malaysia and Brunei Darussalam. Outside of this, David is well known for his policy and advisory roles to government and business on trade, education, and sport, including Director of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Economic Division, and chairing the government's Trade for All Advisory Board. Moderating the discussion, we're in the very able hands of Surinand Sachanand. Surinand is a proud New Zealander with family links to Fiji and India. During his professional career as a lawyer, judge, and ombudsman, he served as New Zealand's 19th Governor General from 2006 until 2011. And since then, he's worked internationally, chairing the Commonwealth Foundation in London, Transparency International, and locally, he's an honorary advisor of the Asian New Zealand Foundation, Chancellor of the University of Waikato, and patron of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs. So Surinand will lead the conversation for the next 45 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please think of the questions as we go along and send them in the chat box, so that we can address them after the panel has discussed. Over to you, Surinand.
Thank you, Christine. Namaste, namaskar, good evening, and ngā mihi o te po, which is the greeting for good evening in New Zealand Māori. My role as moderator is to be a catalyst in the Aspen tradition of enabling an insightful discussion to be enjoyed by the audience. And I note that there are people from a number of countries, including India and New Zealand, who are on this line. The two countries, India and New Zealand, have been famously described as the bookends of Asia. Their connections of the past have been in terms of things like the Commonwealth, sport, and commerce. But the modern world is calling for a reset of that and to encompass other things, such as technology, talent, and trade. And in the course of this discussion, you will observe how timely it is that Christine Sharp and her colleagues have brought this together. India's sheer size has given it geopolitical clout, and now its rise economically makes it essential that New Zealand invests in the relationship to a far greater extent. The growth in the New Zealand population of people of Indian descent is an asset in this. That is Christine and myself and our colleagues, have devised a set of questions to enable this dialogue to proceed. The first question has a slightly long beginning to it, but you'll see the point of it. The Indian Foreign Minister, the Honourable Subramaniam Jaishankar, who was in New Zealand in late 2022, said that the time for a free trade agreement between India and New Zealand was now off the table, and that the next steps in advancing the relationship should be led by business interests. The New Zealand Foreign Minister, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta, speaking at a conference in New Zealand just a few weeks ago, said there is a lot that India and New Zealand can do more of together in the region, finding ways forward to our economic benefit, upholding and advocating for regional rules, norms and institutions, and expanding our bilateral defence and security cooperation. Now, distilling those two statements by two senior ministers in each of the countries, I'm going to ask our distinguished panelists, do they agree? Can the two, business and defence, work together, or is there a broader perspective? Can I invite you first, Your Excellency David Pine, to address this question?
Thank you very much, Sir Anand, and namaste to everybody. I'll say kia ora because I'm in the middle of broad daylight here in Delhi. Well, I mean, if the question is, do I agree with what my minister and the minister of my host government has said, I wouldn't be much of a diplomat if I didn't answer that with yes. But I can go a bit further than that and say I certainly strongly agree. I think it's important to put Minister Jaishankar's comments in their full context first. In taking the FTA off the table, he was trying to remove something that, instead of enhancing our relationship, had become an obstacle to it. And that's at the same time that he was saying, let's not go down the FTA route, he was saying stronger commercial relationships need to be right at the heart of our relationship. If you look at all of India's FTA partners, you'll see a consistent pattern. FTAs have not been a catalyst to stronger economic relations with other countries. They've been a consequence of them. And we need to we need to kind of lift the relationship from where it is. And he was strongly advocating, as Minister Goyal does, and as our ministers have strongly agreed, that we need to think about building the relationships at a personal level between our business leaders. And we've got some strong ideas for how we're going to do that we'll come to later in the discussion. The specific question of defence, I think it's certainly true, Sir Anand, as you've framed it so well, that an economic relationship needs to be in the context of a wider relationship, and also that an economic relationship needs to think much more broadly than trade. I think both those things sit either side of the economic relationship. So we don't participate strongly in the Indian defence industry, but it's certainly true that the tides of history are pushing both countries closer together and in the same direction. So what we're doing in defence, we've just signed a white shipping agreement. We're about to sign a defence cooperation agreement. We're seeing more frequency of high-level contact, is all of a piece and consistent with what we're trying to do in the economic relationship. And I think that's the key point.
Thank you. I think what you've said makes the new phrase Indo-Pacific have a lot more meaning than it did even 2 or 3 years ago.
Absolutely.
This is a good point at which to invite you, Indrani Bagchi, to offer your comment about these two elements of business and defence and security.
Thank you, Sir Anand. And on behalf of Ananta Aspen Center, may I say how pleased we are to be participating in this discussion today. To answer your question, Sir Anand, I not only believe that defense and business can walk together, I think they have to walk together. When, in the last 5 years, I think, maybe a little longer, India has reviewed a lot of its FTAs, especially in the Southeast Asian region. And most of those most of the reviews have come back to say, as David said, that it didn't really benefit the Indian economy that much. Instead, a lot of emphasis by this government has been on making it easier for others to do business in India. This ease of doing business is a big part of the Modi government's policies. And we've seen a steady easing up on the bureaucratic and regulatory hurdles to business in India. I think about 1,500 obsolete laws have been taken off the books just to make it easier to do business. The way the government looks at it, it is that if you allow businesses to work in India and to work in New Zealand, it automatically creates that circumstance or that environment of cooperation, which then makes it easier to do deeper stuff in terms of free trade agreements. Just so that you know, free trade agreements are not really the flavor of this government or even some of its biggest trading partners like the US. On the defense front, I think there is a lot that can be done between India and New Zealand. If you have seen that Indo-Pacific is now the central part of India's foreign policy. A lot of it crisscrosses with New Zealand's interests. A lot of it crisscrosses with our convergences. We can see growing convergences between New Zealand and India, especially on defense and security. And we've seen a steady uptick in a more strategic conversation between these two countries. And I think that's all for the good. If you go back to trade, I think the two countries are working in the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. If you know anything about India, India is a hesitant trader, is a hesitant trading power. And even in IPEF, we have stayed out of the trade pillar of IPEF. But there are other pillars to work on, and there is a huge economic component in the other pillars. So to put it in another way, we would, the way India looks at it, we want more business, we want more investment, and we want a deeper economic relationship between India and New Zealand. The route to that doesn't have to be an FTA. On the other hand, in the defense sector, we can see much greater convergences happening in the Indo-Pacific because of the geopolitical trends in the region and because of how we perceive the future. As you know, India is part of the Quad, but I know that during 2021, New Zealand was part of a Quad Plus mechanism, where New Zealand participated in Quad Plus meetings while it was in the middle of the pandemic, and I think we were all consumed with dealing with the pandemic at that point. It opened a door to the possibilities of cooperation in both humanitarian and security aspects. I'll leave it here for the time being.
I'm going to ask you to pause there because you've advanced the notion of convergence so far as our two themes are concerned, but you've also used the first of several acronyms that seem to flow in this area of the relationships between our two countries. IPEF is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and Quad is the quadrilateral security dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, but not New Zealand, which is why you said Quad Plus. All of you people who are listening, that we've prepared in anticipation of there being several acronyms in the ether, a list of all the acronyms which you'll be able to access at the end of the program. And what I've said is by no means any criticism, Indrani, of your valuable opening address. Can I switch then to Jagannath? From your standpoint, you spend much of your professional life in Stockholm, but you have a particular interest in the Indo-Pacific, and you're speaking to us today from the Middle East. We're very interested to hear your take on this development of the relationship between India and New Zealand.
Thank you very much, Sir Anand. Excellent to have you as the moderator of this session, and my thanks to also Ananta Aspen Center in India, Aspen New Zealand Institute for this kind invitation. Great to have High Commissioner David Pine and also Christine and Ms. Vakchi here as co-panelists. I think I would agree with the two earlier comments that was shared by Ms. Vakchi and High Commissioner David Pine. I think let me address these questions more from a scholastic point of view, is that I think defense industry and defense trade is an important part of trade and economic contacts in today's age. So therefore, we cannot really isolate defense dealings from the economic or trade dealings, even though they do look from different spectrums of branches. And of course, there are debates that whether we should really prioritize the trade and economics ahead of defense. But I think in today's context, defense industry, defense trade are a critical component of trade and economic contact. But more importantly, I think in the context of India and New Zealand, what we have to learn is that I think we have to take examples from the region itself. Let's take the example of India and South Korea. If we take the India-South Korea relationship into account, it has both trade and economic components attached with defense components. Similarly, if we take into account India-Japan relations, it has strong trade and economic components, but at the same time, strong security components imbibing into Indo-Pacific undercurrents. So therefore, I think I strongly believe India-New Zealand relationship can have those components, combining both the defense and the trade and economic components. But at the same time, I think what is most important here to understand is that we are living in the age of Indo-Pacific, as other panelists pointed out. We are also living in the age of connectivity. Connectivity is such an issue which brings together both the trade, the economic aspects, as well as the security and the defense components to it. Today, when we're talking about digital connectivity, when we're talking about connectivity in terms of economic components, everything has its security angle attached to it. Similarly, we are also living at the age of maritime politics, and given the geographical position of India exposing to the three sides of the ocean, and New Zealand being at the heart of the Pacific Ocean, both are natural partners in terms of forging a stronger maritime relationship. And I think when we're talking about stronger maritime relationship, trade economics, as well as the security components, some of the defense components comes into it naturally. The last point here is also, I think we are here also talking about an age of the prominence of middle powers, powers which are not necessarily superpowers, who are not necessarily really minor powers or the really emerging powers. Here, India has a significant foothold in the Indo-Pacific regions. New Zealand is a critical power in the, not only in the Pacific Ocean world, but also in the entire Indo-Pacific regions, having a stronger links with the Five Eyes, partners. And I think that brings both these countries into as a kind of a prospective natural partner to think about building a relationship which will have both security, defense, as well as trade and economic components to it. So I think I would strongly pitch that business and defense can go together. And I think we need to think innovatively into this context. Thank you.
Dr. Panda, thank you for your perspective on this issue. I'm now going to unbundle that question into something more simple and to ask each of you, beginning with Indrani, then perhaps you, Jagannath, and then you, High Commissioner Pine, if you were the architect of building the new relationship, what elements would you emphasize and in what order? Let's say you had the opportunity to be the architect. Indrani?
I would emphasize security cooperation and connectivity in that order.
Thank you. Jagannath?
I think I would agree, but I think in order to go ahead with security and connectivity contacts, we need a strong people-to-people contact. So we already have a strong, Indian diaspora living in New Zealand, but we need to translate those contacts into kind of partnerships. Today we are having a relationship. I think the time has come to transfer that relationship into a credible partnerships. So people-to-people contacts, transforming into stronger trade and economic contacts, and then we transferring it to a credible maritime and ocean-centric contacts. I would see it in that order.
David, I've put you last in this list because I realize that as a practicing diplomat, you have to be a little constrained. But constraint aside, you may have some ideas about the order of things and how they might proceed.
Sure. I think any analysis of the diagnosis has to precede, the prescription, doesn't it? From my point of view, the fundamental problem of the relationship at the moment isn't a lack of goodwill. It isn't a lack of common interest. It's the thinness of engagement. And I think when the problem is thinness, when the patient's malnourished, you don't want to spend too much time prioritizing proteins or carbohydrates. I think you've got to try and get your hands on as much of both and get it to the patient. So my view is that a certain amount of opportunism is called for without losing focus. But basically, when we get opportunities in both areas, we've got to grab them with both hands. And I really don't see much point in trying to rank our security interests and our economic interests relative to each other. I think we've got to recognise that both are absolutely essential, that we won't advance one without advancing the other, and just take every opportunity we can find.
Thank you.
At the heart of that, I think, is better connectivity.
Right. In supporting the role of India and New Zealand in the Indo-Pacific region and cooperation between them, there are some, for instances, which I'd like you all to kind of make a comment about. Defence, scientific exploration, climate change. There are three issues certainly in New Zealand, and there may well be views to be expressed from India. Particularly when we think of the region and the Pacific Islands and possible awkwardnesses that there are, like Taiwan. But I'd like to give you, each of you, an opportunity to speak about defence, science and climate change, for example, as part of this convergence that has emerged as a new word in this discussion. Dr. Panda, would you like to go first on that?
Well, I think this is an interesting question in the sense that I think we need to understand and situate the relationship of India and New Zealand in an innovative context. And I think there are 2 points needs to be discussed a little more in terms of future context, as well as how India and New Zealand can build this partnership. And I think the first point here is that we need to really talk about the security order, the regional security order or the global order, which is transforming gradually, which is evolving from time to time. And if we see, I think the primary debate about order today is, order has been a contested phenomenon. And the primary debate here is that whether this order is inclusive or inclusive order we are talking about. From India's point of view, I think when India is talking about Indo-Pacific, India is talking about an inclusive order. And New Zealand comes there as a natural partner, being from the Indo-Pacific regions. In fact, if we see, this is what India and the current regime in Delhi is continuously talking about. Prime Minister Modi, when he talked about Sagar, the security and growth for all in the regions, he talked about an inclusive vision of India's Indo-Pacific construct. He talked about New Zealand coming into play, West coming into play, including EU, European Union, which is in fact not geographically very aligned with the Indo-Pacific regions, coming into the play with that inclusive order. So India's vision of order, which is very much inclusive, that brings New Zealand as a partner. And I think we need to capitalize on that. If we could recollect, China talked about Asia for Asians in 2016, excluded most of the Western affiliated countries, including New Zealand, Australia. So I think that's what we need to keep it in mind. The second one is the security order. I think here there are 2 competing issues we need to identify in order to push forward India and New Zealand partnership. We are talking about a cooperative security order. We are also talking about a collective security order. New Zealand mostly believes in collective security order because it has been a part of the Five Eyes formulations. Whereas India talks about cooperative security order. Therefore, India is a part of the Quad and many other formulations because it is not an alliance per se. Quad is more of a framework, open framework, even though it is becoming a much more official framework. So therefore, between this cooperative security order and collective security order, we have to position India and New Zealand security interest. So therefore, I would agree with Ms. Bakchi earlier that even though there is nothing called Quad Plus in an official capacity, but I think during the pandemic, New Zealand coming into the play to be a part of the Quad discussion opens a lot of opportunities to discuss in minilateral, multilateral frameworks, IPF to Quad Plus to trilateral. In fact, we could think about innovatively trilateral forums, India, New Zealand, and some of the Southeast Asian countries, including India, New Zealand, and some of the Pacific Island countries, because Prime Minister Modi recently went there to Papua New Guinea. And we could think about innovative trilateral platform to talk about both order and security order, which will match both India and New Zealand's security interest.
Yes, I think you made a good point about the visit to Papua New Guinea. It was a good example of the Indo-Pacific in action, because the New Zealand Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, and Narendra Modi met for the first time. There was also the attendance of Fiji. So your idea of the Pacific being involved in a big way was emphasized there. Now, pressing on with this same question, you've obviously spoken from the security perspective. There's science and there's climate change involved in discussion of this question. Indrani, would you like to pick either of those up as being part of the growth of cooperation between the 2 countries?
Yes, indeed, Sir Anand. And I would actually pick climate change because that is one of the driving questions for the world. it's a huge area of emphasis for the Indian government. I don't know if you've seen the most recent report that by the World Economic Forum, that India has actually fulfilled almost all its obligations under the Paris Accord in terms of moving to its green energy transition. So green energy transition is a very big part of the developmental imperative of India. And I think India would find it very useful to work out a cooperative arrangement or a cooperative relationship with New Zealand on climate issues, particularly in marine or in the blue economy areas, because New Zealand has established expertise in that area. And I think that this is a conversation, this is a partnership that can yield benefits for both sides, because there is technology involved in this, there is the future of the planet, but certainly there is also a pivoting of how our economies will have to adapt to climate change, and how our economies will benefit from climate change. How can we make them benefit from climate change? I think that is certainly a conversation that we should be having.
Thank you. David, you've got now a wide field on which to make a comment, if that suits you.
Yes, I'd love to. I don't want to spend any time agreeing furiously with those two comments because you know, basically you can take my agreement to all of that as read, music to my ears. But I mean, I'd start by saying, look, there really is no difference between how India and New Zealand see New Zealand's role in the Indo-Pacific. We really view it the same way. India calls our region Oceania, and we call our region the Pacific. That's about the only difference you could make, but we know we're talking about the same place. And I think since New Zealand adopted the Indo-Pacific language under the previous Prime Minister a few years ago, we've been very clear to say we see our place in that Indo-Pacific region as being firmly rooted in the Pacific. And I think when Dr. Jaishankar came down to New Zealand last year, he saw that. He saw how much Pacifica is part of New Zealand, and he saw what it is that we bring to the relationship and the potential for India's relationships in the region above and beyond what they already get from their engagement with the Partners Direct and with Australia. So all of that is well understood. Just because something has a security purpose doesn't mean that its focus always needs to be on security. So for example, one of the areas where our Pacific colleagues work together in Delhi to approach India in a joined up way is in traditional medicine and traditional health. And you shouldn't underestimate how by engaging together, you're actually supporting, I mean, it's human security that we're talking about. But you're also putting in place the building blocks for regular dialogue that make those other conversations about other aspects of security in a region that we're all very clear we don't want to see militarized. You make and facilitate those other kind of conversations by approaching them obliquely.
Yes.
And that would be the point I would make.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in your mention of indigenous medicine, because Ayurvedic medicine is well known among people of Indian origin, and there are several 100,000 people of Indian origin living in Fiji. There are 200,000 people of Indian origin in New Zealand, so there is chemistry there for development.
And only this morning, I've just come off a phone call with the Secretary of Ayush, and we're going to have an informal meeting with our Pacific colleagues and explore how we take this stuff forward.
Oh, good. Well, it's taking stuff forward that is a neat segue to turn to our next question, which I'm going to put to you, David and Indrani, about the kinds of things that emerged immediately from what Mr. Jay Shankar spoke and Nanaya Mahuta rejoined about, and that is education and travel. There are a couple of real live, for instances. Education, so many students come from India to New Zealand. There are opportunities for cooperation between universities and other institutes, and of course, travel. The number of people from India traveling for education, but also for tourism, is burgeoning. And we need to know about that in terms of opening up the developing relationship. David, would you like to go first on this? I know this would be
yes,
in and out of your office.
I will, and I'll start by making a point when we prepared for this session, we said we wouldn't bamboozle people with too many stats and data, but I just want to give people one snapshot that gives a scale of the pace of infrastructure development in India, so Kiwis audience can get their heads around it. So we've just had last week Indigo ordering 500 A320s, 500. That starts in 2030, and that complements the 420 aircraft, I think, that Air India have also lined up, which start coming on stream from 2025. I think over the last 9 years, we've seen an airport open on average once every 6 weeks in India. A new airport opens. We've got one on the outskirts of Delhi opening up with 2 runways at the end of next year. The ground was broken for it 6 months ago. This is the pace of the infrastructure development, and it's relevant to our connectivity and travel. There's no question about the potential both in education and in tourism, and we've had big delegations from both in town quite recently. On the education side, we had Deputy Vice-Chancellors, a delegation led by the Chief Executive of Education New Zealand, and 8 Deputy Vice-Chancellors representing all of our universities. One particular area of focus now is just prior to COVID, a New Zealand centre represented by all the universities was established at IIT Delhi, and that's going to be a kind of real showcase for the tertiary relationship. Unfortunately, COVID happened and momentum slowed a little bit on that one, but we are working very actively to revive that because it was a great idea and there's a lot of goodwill on both sides to get it done. And we want to invite commercial partners into that, and we're looking at how that could be done. On the travel side, you might think with all these aircraft coming online, we'll have a direct flight tomorrow. We won't have a direct flight tomorrow, but we will have one in a period of a number of years that could be counted on the fingers of one hand, and hopefully not using all of them, and maybe ignoring the thumb as well. The constraint there is pretty obvious, isn't it? Airlines are still rebuilding capacity, and for the kind of airlines who are interested in that Auckland-Delhi route, which I think undoubtedly would be the first one to get started, that's a long-haul point-to-point route. They're not the most profitable routes. We know it's economically sustainable. We know there'll be an immediate boost, and we know we've got the traffic to make it workable. And the airlines know this too, and so do the airports. But they've got to service more profitable routes in America and Europe first. That's their priority. And we understand that. We're making a virtue of necessity by working in a really strategic way so that when it does start, we've got everything joined up in terms of the support that will be available from our tourism promotion bodies, from Education New Zealand. We'll have a cultural package around all of that. So, you know, that the work is already underway to get a direct air service, and that will be the game changer for us. Much bigger, in my opinion, than an FTA ever would have been.
Yes. Indrani, I asked David to go first on this one because I had an inkling that of his enthusiasm for these two matters of travel and education. But I thought it was important for you and Jagannath to understand the real thirst that there is in New Zealand for the development of travel and education opportunities. And that provides perhaps a good background for you to make a comment on this, about how do education and travel fit into the picture of the growing relationship.
Thank you, Sir Anand. I would actually take the example of Spain. You know, Spain was not a country that Indians visited for tourism. That wasn't the first item on their list when they were thinking of going to Europe. It used to be France, it used to be other areas. It took a huge Bollywood blockbuster to put Spain right on top of the Indians' tourism map where Europe is concerned. In New Zealand, just by the way, has been the sort of locale for, again, one of Bollywood's big hits, but that was back in the 90s. And it probably did not occur to the New Zealand government to make the most of that to advance tourism to New Zealand from India. I think the time has come for New Zealand to offer its absolutely beautiful settings for Bollywood tourism, or even for Bollywood to make, or any other. I mean, you know, Indian film industry stretches well beyond Bollywood, and it's just convenient to say Bollywood. But frankly, the South Indian films, East Indian films, they're just everywhere. And somebody should be in New Zealand should think of making money out of getting Bollywood movies to be set in New Zealand. For no other reason, that helps tourism from India marvelously. Second, I would urge David to get the tour operators from India across to New Zealand, because it has become much easier to tour India. There are new areas have opened up for tourism, and I think it would be a very fulfilling exercise if we can advance tourism and travel between New Zealand and India, and they're just ripe for it, in my view. On education, you know, David's spoken quite a lot about it. I don't want to sort of reiterate my agreement on that, but I'll just confine myself to this for the moment.
Right, we've covered tourism and travel, and I'm not asking you to comment on this one, Dr. Panda, because education is not at the forefront of your valuable contribution, but I have got an add-on to travel and tourism, which is to ask you to focus for a moment on the future of Indian students coming to New Zealand universities for degrees and research, and the opportunity that there is for linkages in the opposite direction. New Zealand is going perhaps for postgraduate degree qualifications in India, and there being linkages at the university level. And David has mentioned this recent visit, which came under the flagship of Education New Zealand, with representatives of the 8 New Zealand universities. But perhaps, Indrani, I might get you to start speaking about how you see this flow of students from India coming to countries like New Zealand.
Well, I think there is a definite interest, and I think there are quite a number of students that have been in New Zealand. You know, COVID made things very difficult for everybody. I mean, I don't think we can hold that as an example. I think we should just go back to where we were in getting students across to New Zealand. You know, New Zealand has an excellent example in Australia. I mean, frankly, you should not repeat the mistakes that Australia when Indian students, because we have a steady uptick in students to Australia, but we also had a blip, and I think they had to do a little bit of course correction in that, and I think you can avoid that certainly. But there is an interest, and if we begin with areas where New Zealand has a definite edge. In some of the science areas, in some of the STEM areas, in some of the technology areas, I think there's also in some of the climate studies areas. I've maritime engineering, for instance. All of these, I think, would be of immense interest, because there are. I mean, this is a young country. They're looking for places to go to get educated, and New Zealand would be perfect.
Yes, I'm pleased that you mentioned the word blip, because as Chancellor of a New Zealand university, Waikato, I am familiar with the pastoral responsibility that the government has given to universities for the welfare of their students. And the matter to which you referred in Australia now has been put at the university's doorstep to be mindful of the welfare of students. Dr. Panda, as an academic, you may have a view on this flow of students and how viable it is for and the word is return to the levels pre-COVID, but to go beyond that in the light of these new opportunities.
I think I would agree with most of the points Ms. Bakchi was mentioning, and I think those are excellent points. Just a couple of footnotes to that. I think, students would obviously like to look for good programs, good scholarships, fellowships, and post the studies, maybe job opportunities. So I think building a good capitalist-oriented narratives would be key here. And I'm emphasizing on this because this is how Canada has excelled and invited a lot of Indian students. This is how Australia has excelled, invited a lot of students. In fact, today I'm based there in Europe. I could see most of the European universities are also trying to do the same to, after their relationship with China has gone sore, they are trying to move the Indian students to come to Europe. So I think we need to also take all of these things into account and make a proper public and public campaigning in India. India has so many newspaper, digital platforms. I think advertisement of good programs, good universities, and attractive programs, making it student friendly with fellowships and with job opportunities. Those kind of things, if we could, plan it well in advance in the media circulations, that will create a good database for the future of India relationship.
Yes, I sense there would be agreement with what you're saying. Can I open up another different avenue, which is to do with the advance of electronic technology? Names like Infosys are well known in New Zealand, and New Zealand has several innovations to its credit also, and I'm sure that David could speak about this, but I'd like to raise the topic of technology playing a role in the development of further connections between India and New Zealand, and invite all of you to have that as the key word in your answers. Would you like to go first, Indrani?
Yes, thank you, Sir Anand. You know, we have, Infosys, of course, is known to everybody, but technology startups are actually exploding, and we are now beyond the era of backroom tech work. Some of the biggest companies in the world have set up their R&D centers in India. So there is a lot of innovation and research and designing that happens in India. This is where we can work with New Zealand, or this creates a kind of an ecosystem, has created a kind of an ecosystem for technology innovation in India that is almost unparalleled. We are, especially in this part of the world. You may have seen the kind of depth given between to technology cooperation between India and the US in last week when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington. I mean, it almost appears that foreign policy between India and the US is now solely technology. So we are looking at a world of technology that is very different from the world of technology that we saw even 6 years ago. And I think India would be a good place for New Zealand startups, technology startups, to set up a house, to begin the investment process. India is now home to technology startups from many countries. It's a sort of a virtuous cycle of creating an ecosystem which makes it easier for technology cooperation, for technology partnership, certainly in areas that were not looked at before, whether it is in terms of service, whether it is in terms of futuristic areas like space. And the other area of technology cooperation that I would mention and I would emphasize is, one of the has been a huge success in India, which we don't talk about that much, is what we call the India digital stack, or the India stack. And this is the whole area of using technology for public good, for delivering benefits, welfare benefits. It's quite a unique system that has been designed over the last decade, and it has worked seamlessly even during COVID, because one of the things that it did was to be able to transfer benefits to the people who needed it during COVID without, in an anonymized way. One of the key elements of the digital stack and the welfare benefits that rolls out as a result of this stack, which, by the way, for people who are not aware of it, is we call it the JAM. It is a low-cost bank account which has been made available to Indians, and not all Indians had access to bank accounts. It is the Aadhaar, which is the unique biometric identity system, and your mobile phone. India is literally the largest user of mobile phones all over the world now. We have almost 750 mobile phones. So this is the ecosystem of technology that can be worked on.
You've given us a wonderful start there. I think many of us will put Digital Stack and JAM and Abhar on our to-do list to look up further about, aside from listening today to this great discussion. I'll ask you, Dr. Panda, for a quick comment on this matter of electronic technology, and then David, for you to sum up on this, seen from a New Zealand point of view. Dr. Panda?
Very quickly, I think I'll refer this in the context of India, Sweden, and India Nordic ties, because I'm based there in Stockholm. So I take it as a reference, not as a copy from India-Sweden relations to situate in India, New Zealand, but more as a reference. How come India's relationship with Nordic countries, particularly with Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, is progressing? One of the key arc of this relationship is sustainable development and technological partnerships that is emerging. And I think there are many areas, as Ms. Bagchi pointed out, I think there are many areas what India and New Zealand could really factor into their relationship, eventually turning into a credible partnership. In sustainable development, I think the key would be how to think innovatively in terms of engaging in marine technology, manufacturing technology, digital technology, artificial intelligence, cyber technology, space technology can be one area. So there are many areas where we could talk about kind of innovative ways of engagement, and most importantly renewable energy. I mean, if we're talking about energy collaboration or renewable energy collaboration, eventually we have to depend on technological hubs, on technological corporations. So I think these are the areas where India New Zealand relationship can thrive, and we should strongly refer how India's relationship with geographically distant countries who are situated far away from India, how those relationships are thriving, and we could take a reference from there.
Thank you. David, this gives you an opportunity to do what we used to call a rejoinder. There's a lot of capacity here, isn't there?
There certainly is. I can't, in all truthfulness, compare the range or intensity of what's going on between India and New Zealand with what's going on between India and the US. But there's a lot of good stuff already going on, and there's a lot of potential to do more. In fact, New Zealand company is already producing one of the most critical applications for India's space program, and it's doing it here in India. I think Indrani's point about the potential to come here is true. It also ties in with the message on education that both of our two previous speakers gave so eloquently and subtly, but we get that message a lot more directly from the Indian government. Basically, it's the old model of just using India as a place to source students is gone, and the future is going to belong to the countries that participate in India in education. And it doesn't need to be through bricks and mortar, it can be any kind of model. But we get that message very directly, and you can be assured that our universities and other institutions have heard it loud and clear. I think two things I'd like to say on this. One, with respect to the India stack, in our recent meeting, we had a roundtable that was chaired by, under the auspices of the Secretary of Commerce, where we were identifying sectors for cooperation, and one of the sectors the Indian side put on the table was UPI. And I think looking at how New Zealand, as a small developed country with a large diaspora, it's still an early enough stage in the global rollout of UPI where we could think about using New Zealand as a sort of a laboratory because of our size and the scale of for testing ideas. And I think there's a real opportunity there. And I don't think we're too late to grasp it. And if it works for UPI, it could work very well for other aspects of the digital stack. And I think that's the way we should be encouraging India to think about New Zealand. It's a small, well-functioning, rules-based system with a significant diaspora. And that makes it an interesting laboratory for a lot of these ideas.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our discussion is unhappily approaching its sunset, because we've covered a huge amount of territory, and you have, each of you, replied with considerable bandwidth and given all of us listening, and I include myself, a great deal of interest for the future. I'd like to perhaps begin a round off. It's obvious from what you've said that you speak positively about the future. I'd like to have a full list in front of me of questions that have been raised by people in the audience, and I'll take a couple and see whether you might have a view to offer, each of you. To boost confidence building measures between India and New Zealand, is there any space in the humanitarian sector that the two countries can cooperate on? We've covered a number of areas, but not the humanitarian sector. Is that something you'd like to speak briefly about? Can we perhaps start with you, Indrani?
On the humanitarian sector, yes.
Yes.
You know, one of the things that the two countries haven't explored as much, and I think should, is on what we call humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. This is certainly because New Zealand, I think New Zealand would be such a good partner for India, especially in the Pacific region. The areas of the South China Sea, etc., we would be looking for partners in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. It is a way for India to be present in these regions. It is a way for New Zealand to be present with India, and it is a way for India and New Zealand to cooperate literally on the ground and on the sea. I think there is immense possibility in humanitarian assistance.
Okay, I've got another question, which is that New Zealand is known for its advancement in renewable energy and sustainability. Can any of the panelists give us a brief idea on ongoing collaboration or knowledge sharing with India in this domain, renewable energy and sustainability? Dr. Panda, is that something within your sphere of interest and knowledge?
Maybe I'll leave this, pass these questions to High Commissioner David Pyle.
David, yes.
He would be the most
David
appropriate person.
Yeah, well, look, if I can start, one of the areas where New Zealand has shared its expertise in other countries, but not India, has been in geothermal. And there's surprisingly little interest and potential, really, for geothermal in a country with lots of mountains and earthquakes. You'd imagine there would be more. But I think the big area for us is that's going to come on stream. If you think about what New Zealand is going to need to do in purchasing carbon credits offshore, I think we're only beginning to have that discussion with India now, but obviously India has to be a big part of that discussion. If you think about what's going to have an impact on the concerns of our neighbours, the existential concerns of our neighbours as they feel the oceans lapping up onto their island shores. Sure, we could and should spend some money helping them making their own island sustainability, but the place where effort is going to actually have impact on the global situation is in India. It's the place where the world has an obligation. India's development challenges and how sustainability fits into those can't possibly be seen by the world as a burden that India should carry alone. India is responsible for bringing, improving the lives of 1.4 billion people, a fifth of humanity. It didn't create climate change. So to my mind, it's a global burden. And I think we should be looking at how we meet our own obligations, to purchase carbon credits in a constructive way in India. I think that's got to be a huge part. And that discussion is beginning now.
Okay. Well, I want to leave the final word with Christine Sharp of Aspen, New Zealand. But there's a quick item, which is a person of Indian origin you'll understand me posing just before I hand over to Christine. And that is that in this part of the Indo-Pacific, there are 200,000 people of Indian origin living in New Zealand. There are even more, perhaps double that, in Fiji. I know of the modern India's attitude towards people of Indian origin, exemplified by the Pravasi Bharatiya engagements each year. I want to ask you whether or how you can see the Indian diaspora playing a role in advancing the relationship between New Zealand and India. A quick final comment, and then it'll be over to you, Christine. Who's going to go first? Indrani?
Well, the Indian diaspora has been a very big part of Indian foreign policy, certainly by this government. And I think the Indian diaspora is an example of, it encapsulates what India is, which is, diverse people living under a constitution. But I think one of the things that make the Indian diaspora so special is how well they integrate in their host country, in the countries that they choose to make their home. And I think that is that's almost unique to Indian diaspora. So it's a way of taking this forward.
David, would you have a comment to make, and then we'll go to Christine?
Yes, I would. It puzzles me, right? We have a very significant diaspora. It's actually a lot more than 200,000. I think when we see the next census come out, it'll be closer to 300,000, which would be 6% of our population, which is massive. And it's recent. But we aren't seeing the impact on the relationship yet. So there's clearly something we need to do to turn potential energy into kinetic energy that we haven't found. But one thing I would say is that diplomacy starts at home. And, we've just seen the survey that the Asian New Zealand Foundation puts out on attitudes. And it's very clear that New Zealand is in a critical moment of making its mind up about India. 56% of people surveyed were either neutral or don't know when asked a question about levels of trust with India. It's definitely tracking in the right direction, but the number of people who are making their minds up is much higher with India than with any other country. So there's a lot to play for. The Asian New Zealand Foundation operates on a theory that there's a positive correlation between exposure and improving attitudes. So the more people are exposed to Indian New Zealanders, the more they will tend to view India positively. And I believe that's true. But at the moment, we're seeing a much bigger impact on the attitude towards the Philippines, for example, than we are on the attitude towards India. And I think, we see great things like, Diwali. I'd love to see it broadened. I'd love to see how New Zealanders reacted to Holi, for example. I think that would show a whole different side of Indian culture that Kiwis would respond to. Very positive.
Okay. So there's a challenge there as well as an acceptance of the reality. Christine, that seems a good point on which to ask you to round things off. Thank you. I know you're waiting to do.
Absolutely. I have to applaud the panel and Sir Anand for leading such a fascinating discussion. I think this is only the beginning, and we have really set the bar very high. And there are many threads of conversations here that need to be picked up. There are many questions that haven't been answered, and I know that we can direct them to the right people, so we'll try and answer them through email. But thank you, everyone. I wanted to include Indrani in this as the two Aspens together. It's our first, and it's been a real pleasure, and we really do hope that you're going to join us for the next few. We hope to have it. We'll plan to have another one in a couple of months, delving into one of the threads of this conversation. It may well be technology, education, or travel. We'll have a think about that from this discussion. So thank you, everyone. Indrani, any closing comment? It's 8 o'clock on the dot in New Zealand. You're mute.
You're muted.
I am muted. Thank you so much, Christine, and it is our pleasure to be partnering with Aspen New Zealand. We look forward to the next set of conversations on this, and we don't want this to stop. So thank you very much, everybody.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think,